really the theme of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that China has bought off the American aristocracy, or at least has certainly gotten their hands deep down their throat, and so, and there's a lot of money to be made. Now, one could make the argument, you break it down, you talk about the Bidens, you talk about Trudeau, you talk about the Bushes, you talk about Capitol Hill, you talk about Silicon Valley. I mean, you got these crazy stories about how Mark Zuckerberg and his wife walked up to Xi at a party and asked Xi to name their child. It's like, whoa, bro, what's going on, guys? We have a very good show for you today. I read a book called Red-Handed, how the Chinese have bought off the American elite. The theme of the book is basically, has the Communist Party bought off the American aristocracy? And Peter Schweizer, who wrote a book called Red-Handed, does a very good job of basically making this argument. American companies have helped China with their facial recognition technology, with some of their weapons systems, because the money is too big to ignore. And then he talks about the Biden corruption scandal. You don't read about this much. You don't hear about this much nowadays because everybody's so concerned with Trump corruption. But believe me, when it comes to the Bidens, it seems there's enough corruption to go around. President Biden has had to face a number of trials and tribulations over the course of his presidency, and you could make the argument unlike any president that has come before him. Now, look, let's do a little quick history lesson. Teddy Roosevelt had to fight against the Spanish and against monopolies. FDR fought against the Nazis and the Japanese. Reagan fought against Russia. And if you're a liberal, you'd say the poor. But here's the thing. Biden, like those great men before him, has bravely stared down his own challenges. All right? The man, he's got a stutter. All right? Let's be honest. And maybe he just glitches, and maybe he died in 2017, and that's just an animatronic puppet. I don't know. I don't like making fun of people for their age. But he has had his battles with bicycles and anything in general that requires or where you have to contend with gravity. I'm not trying to be mean, but, he's had his issues with raised platforms. He's gone to war politically, fighting with Republicans across the aisle over the $75 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars given to Ukraine, and will likely be his most expensive battle lost. But we'll see. He's also had issues on the home front. He's gotten in the mat over Social Security budgets as people older than the hills, older than rocks, have had to advocate for one another, as well as the semiconductor spending, which should see the U.S. making their own computer chips in the next few years, centuries. How long is it going to take to get this computer chip business online? Some people say 10 years. Either way, if I'm Taiwan, the big question is, once we don't need their computer chip manufacturing anymore, are we really going to go to war with China if China decides to invade? Man, if I was Taiwan right now, I'd be buying all the guns, all the rockets, all the torpedoes. Because remember, they are surrounded by a moat. But I would not be relying on America. Either way, I'll tell you this, though. Joe Biden's biggest battle, the Frazier to his Ali right now, is none other than his baby boy, Hunter. Hunter's aptly named, by the way. He can sniff out a molecule of crack in an old shag carpet. That's good stuff. Either way, okay. But he's like a beagle with a very serious drug problem. And a recovering addict. Let's not make fun of somebody for having an addiction. Let's have some compassion, for real. I don't want to turn this into something where it's like, ha, ha, ha. We all have our problems. And he's sober, and I wish him all the best. All right? He's got enough problems as it is. But Hunter's lifestyle of the rich and famous makes Rick James look like Nancy Pelosi. You could make that argument. At least they're going to make that argument in court. Although when I say Nancy Pelosi, I should exclude Paul. That guy, he can party. I'm kidding. The guy with the hammer broke into his back window, and I hope that guy spends a long time in jail. And I hope Paul Pelosi is recovering. But speaking of Paul Pelosi, in this book, Red Handed, Peter Schweizer does a very good job of asking some very important questions. Very important questions. You're going to get to these questions, man, when we see this. But let's not digress. Let's get back to Hunter. Hunter's drug use and criminality is so sloppy that even a legally blind man who owned a computer shop in Delaware was able to bust him. I mean, those images cut right through the problems he was having with his retina, apparently, because, some of those videos are, they were a little too racy to even show, certainly to anybody under 18. I mean, damn. But that's what crack will do to you. Makes you crazy horny. Either way, there's a lot here that nobody is really, especially in the Biden clan, is really ready to expose. But my guest today, Peter Schweizer, has written a book about this. He's written this book, Red Handed, How American Elites Get Rich Helping China. And I got to tell you, man, there's some crazy stuff here. I mean, we're going to touch on some pretty shocking facts. He breaks down the fact that Silicon Valley, Capitol Hill, Wall Street are all in bed with China. Now, some of this is on the up and up. Some of this is just business, but not when it causes our power elites to scale back their criticism of China's human rights violations, etc. And he makes this very, very compelling argument. And it's true that our elites, look, according to the book, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife walked up to President Xi, Chairman Xi of China, the most powerful man in China, and said, "Will you do us the honor of naming our child?" That's kind of crazy to me. Justin Trudeau, when asked what system of government he admired the most, apparently, according to this book, said the Chinese government, the Chinese system of government. I mean, you're going to find out that this book claims that the Biden family has taken over $30 million in bribes from the Chinese government. So to that, I ask one question. How can I start working for the Chinese? No, but seriously. Look, the Chinese Communist Party is a global threat to democracy. And the insinuation that our sitting president is in dealings with them is enraging and heartbreaking. Corruption, whether it's on the Republican side of the aisle or the Democratic side of the aisle, has to be exposed. It's got to be called out. And you cannot play favorites here. And I don't care if you're sympathetic to one candidate or the other. You got to call it for what it is. It's a threat to our democracy. The minute our institutions are compromised, we are in serious trouble, man. And I think that this book is, it's an important book. And someone like Peter Schweizer, whether you agree with him or not, these voices are very important because someone like Peter has done the investigative work and written a book. I know most of us are too busy to read a book, but at least listen to this podcast and you'll get a sense of why reading books like this is important, why staying informed, and why holding on to the integrity of our institutions and rooting out corruption wherever it may be is critical to preserving the integrity of our democracy. So, I hope you enjoy this episode.
Bryan Callen, this is his intro song. Bryan Callen, it's one hell of an intro song. His comedy is marvelous. He's a genius in world politics.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the mother and father of all podcasts, where you learn everything. And one of the things I like to do is bring on people that are having an impact on the narrative, on the conversation, and pushing back on the narrative where most of us are given by most of what goes on in the media. My next guest, Peter Schweizer, is a political consultant and writer. He is president of the Government Accountability Institute, senior editor-at-large at Breitbart News, and a former fellow at the Hoover Institution, which is a think tank. He is the author of Red Handed, Well, he's the author of a lot of books, but most recently, the book I read, Red-Handed: How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win. Peter, welcome to the show. And we were talking just before this that you have, when I go to Wikipedia and look you up, you are considered far right. Having read your book from start to finish, I didn't see anything far right there. You were just asking some questions that I think a lot of us have, but you are part of the quote unquote far right Breitbart News and far right Hoover Institution, and everybody's far right who seems to grate against the corporate media's current narrative. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point, Brian. I mean, part of the strategy they employ is attack the messenger. In Red-Handed or in all the books that I've released, I don't use anonymous sources. I use corporate records. I use, financial records. It's all there in black and white. And I'm one of those old-fashioned people, Brian, that believes there are not right-wing facts or left-wing facts. They're just facts. I mean, if something true or is something not true.
So you don't believe in your truth and my truth. There's the truth. Right?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, in other words, if in fact you have corporate financial records that show a politician got $1 million, let's say from a Chinese company, it's either true or it's not true. It doesn't matter if the person you're talking about is left-wing or right-wing. It doesn't matter if the person bringing it up is left-wing or right-wing. It's either factually true or not.
Expand on this label of far right when you're just somebody who's reporting facts, and they might be facts that seem to grate against the narrative, the corporate media's narrative, for example, which generally is slanted somewhat in the Democrats' favor.
Yeah, I think this label that they throw around of right-wing, far-right, it's certainly relevant if you're talking about, policy solutions, how we're going to fix this problem, or your view on any basic issue. But when you're actually trying to report on facts, it's either a question of whether a fact is true or whether a fact is not true. The other thing is the label, to me, far-right. I mean, honestly, my political philosophy, I'm what you would call a classical liberal, going back to like John Locke. I'm distrustful of concentrated power, whether it's the government, whether it's private companies. I like there to be divisions in power because I don't trust people that have a lot of authority over other people. That has nothing to do ultimately with the kind of research and work that we do. So to me, it's a classic example of attack the messenger. When you can't deal with the facts, you attack the messenger and you try to distract the conversation. The problem is, I think they've gone to this well too many times, and it's starting to wear thin, and people are starting to realize that it really isn't an easy way to deal with the truth, to just categorize people and try to silence them. You actually have to confront the information. And part of that, Brian, is because the mainstream media, the corporate media, the government has lied to the American people so many times now. They're starting to see that the jig is up, and maybe we need to start listening to these different voices who are actually, giving us facts and information based on real black and white evidence.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that there seems to be a difference between polling and what the media reports on. So you'll see this now more and more. There's a story. So let's just take the Hunter Biden thing, which we're going to get into. All you read about is the hundreds of articles on Trump's corruption, on the indictments. And right. It's almost a blackout when you've got, when it comes to the Hunter Biden scandal. Jamie Comer just came out and said, this is the first time we are seeing wire transfers of $260,000 that didn't go to Hunter Biden, but seem to have gone to Joe Biden's house. That's a big story. And despite the fact that it seems to me the media wants to keep that kind of out of our minds, out of the voters' minds, it's still tracking. And you can see that this story is not going away. So that's interesting. And
yeah, that's a hugely important point, Brian, because what's happened with this story, and it's happened on other stories, you could look at issues related to COVID and the lockdowns. What's happened is the American people are far ahead of the corporate media. And it's becoming so glaring, it's embarrassing, and it's leading to a further erosion in the trust of the media. I saw a poll the other day that the trust in the American mainstream media is actually lower than the U.S. Congress, which is hard to believe. U.S. Congress is at like 18% approval rating. Mainstream media is below that. And part of that is stories like the Hunter Biden story. They don't cover this. They've been blind to it. I first wrote about it, the deals in China, the deal in Ukraine, back in 2018. It was basically ignored by the mainstream media. Nobody covered it. There were some outlets, talk radio, Fox, a few other outlets covered it. That was it. And yet, where are we today? Poll after poll, CNN, Harvard Harris, these are all mainstream pollsters, have asked, and consistently 60% of the American people believe that Joe Biden engaged in corrupt acts or was involved in the corrupt commercial enterprise involving his family. That's 6 out of 10 Americans. If you based it on the mainstream media coverage, it would be 16% because the media is not covering it, but people are getting information from somewhere else. And what they're finding, Bryan, is, wait a minute, there's this whole universe of information and facts that I'm not being told by NBC, I'm not being told by ABC, yet is truthful and is bearing truth and fruit in terms of where the story's going. I need to stop paying attention to what the corporate media is telling me and actually look for other sources of information. That can be podcasts, that can be books, that can be online publications. And as I always say, whenever you read something, look at it in terms of common sense, but also look at it in terms of facts. What kind of evidence are they bringing forward? Don't look at what they're telling you. Look at what they're showing you. Look at them showing you the facts. And so the mainstream media, in my mind, on the Hunter Biden narrative and story are way, way, way behind. The American people have noticed it, and it's a further blemish on them. And the mainstream media is going to have to make this choice. Do they want to keep killing their reputation and their brand by protecting these powerful figures in Washington, D.C., or do they want to try to resurrect any faith that's left that the American people has in what they're doing by actually covering stories that run contrary to the prevailing DC narrative? And that's going to be a tough choice they're going to have to make, but it's going to determine, I would argue, the future of some of these news organizations.
It's going to have to, because people always forget that CNN, Fox, whoever it is, they have shareholders. And if people stop watching and they can't sell as much advertising and those dividends go down, that there's going to be hell to pay. And like everything else, money talks, baby. And they have everyone in this in the corporate media has a big hole to climb out of, because as you said, nobody is listening. And the only way you get people to listen is by getting back to investigative journalism, which is the stuff that you do. And I want to talk about this book, Red Handed, because it came out a year ago. And, obviously you were looking into this Hunter Biden, Joe Biden stuff a long time before I started hearing about it. And you do a painstaking job, a really interesting job of looking at how China, really the theme of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that China has bought off the American aristocracy, or at least has certainly gotten their hands deep down their throat, And so, and there's a lot of money to be made. Now, one could make the argument, you break it down, you talk about the Bidens, you talk about Trudeau, you talk about the Bushes, you talk about Capitol Hill, you talk about Silicon Valley. I mean, you got these crazy stories about how Mark Zuckerberg and his wife walked up to Xi at a party and asked Xi to name their child. It's like, whoa, bro, what's going on, guys? There's all this stuff, but you can understand it. When you've got that much money and you have to be a player, one of the scariest things is you outline essentially how Google and a lot of these companies are basically helping China with their surveillance technology, with keeping track of the Uyghurs, and also of figuring out how to make their military more competitive with American military with the technology. And that was shocking to me. It was shocking to me. So bravo on that. I really do recommend the book. It's scary. Are you more optimistic, though, now, a year later, with where China is, with all their problems? Are you not as worried about the China threat in terms of how it influences America as you were a year ago?
That's a great question. In some respects, you can be more optimistic because China has some, serious economic problems. They have a demographic problem. People in this repressive communist country, for some reason, don't want to have children, which seems to be a problem with repressive regimes. Cuba has the same problem. The Soviet Union had the same problem. So in that sense, you can say, 30 years from now, if trends continue, China is going to be less competitive than they are right now, where the trend lines are. We don't know if that's going to change. The question that we have to ask ourselves is this difficult circumstance that Beijing is in going to make them less aggressive or more aggressive? Are they going to become more desperate given where the trend lines are going? And I'm not sure what the answer is there. But the real question here is, are we going to allow the trend lines in China that appear to be negative with the economic trouble, with the demographics, et cetera? Are we going to allow those to sort of go the way that they should go, or are we going to effectively bail out China? And that's where I get worried about our governing elites, Wall Street, certain players in Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., who are so bound financially, their own personal financial fortunes are tied to access to the Chinese market and favorable deals in China, that they're willing to do a whole lot to help China succeed. Joe Biden just recently, made a speech in India where he said, we don't want to contain China. We want China to thrive, which to me is a naive view. If you look at what China's, specifically Xi's stated goals are, which is to surpass the United States militarily, we should not be wanting China to surpass us economically. We should, not go to war with them, but we should certainly not be helping them because their goal and objective is to surpass us. And you have, people on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, I named them in the book, who are so entangled with China, they will do things that benefit China, that even benefit the Chinese military in their technological, race with the United States, because it helps these elites make more money. And that, to me, is the crux of the problem. It's a long-time strategy that Beijing has employed. They call it elite capture. And it's a pretty genius idea, because essentially what it says is, we don't want to go toe-to-toe with a foreign country. We're just going to buy off their elites, and then we're going to kind of get the policies that we want from them. And you got to give them credit. It's worked pretty good so far.
That's a very smart technique. It really is. The idea that we're going to, you talk about what I think you do a really good job of in the book is you kind of show how someone like Nancy Pelosi, who was, when she was younger, Nancy Pelosi was a badass. Nancy Pelosi went to Tiananmen Square. You talk about her unfurling a banner and in sort of basically saying, remember the people that were killed here. And she ran with that banner, and she got the police grabbed her and stuff like that. She was somebody willing to put her money where her mouth was. And I didn't know that about her. So she was a fierce critic of China and their human rights violations. Then you kind of talk about how, as her husband got more and more enmeshed in the Chinese, in Chinese interests, and the dollar sign started to talk, her criticism began to wane. She, in fact, even started to make excuses. Dianne Feinstein, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee, in these things you describe as SCIFs, which are these rooms, these vault-like rooms where the senators who are on the Senate Intelligence Committee sit and talk about the most sensitive stuff you can imagine. And well, okay, that's fine. But China was like, we can't get into those rooms, but we might be able to get to her husband. And her husband's got all these financial interests in China. I don't blame any of these guys for having financial ties in China. It's just that when it starts to bleed into how our politicians don't talk about China, we start to have a problem. And I think you do a really good job of outlining that in the book. But can you just talk a little bit about the difference? There's nothing wrong with having some economic interests in China, right? I mean, this is good business until, though, it starts to affect all the things you talk about in the book. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, I mean,
Different
really
on
important
the
point,
different.
Brian. Absolutely. It's a very important point. And, look, my view is I don't believe we can have total disengagement from China. I think that's a bad idea economically. I think that's a bad idea politically. It's bad for war and peace. But we do need to be smart about what our ties are to China, and particularly as it relates to, powerful figures on Wall Street, Silicon Valley, who are making large campaign donations. They're funding a lot of political campaigns, and Congress, members of Congress and the executive branch in Washington. Because when you do deals with China, it's not like doing deals in Germany or in Tokyo or in Indonesia, where it's a commercial exchange, it's mutual benefit. Both sides are happy with the arrangement. They're moving forward. China always has strings attached. So, for example, if you go back and look at 2017, when Trump announced that he was going to put tariffs on Chinese goods, set aside your view on tariffs, whether you think that's a good idea. What did China do? When those announcements happened, China did not send a fleet of diplomats to Washington, D.C. to lobby the Trump administration to change its mind. They sent a group of lobbyists to Wall Street, and they went to the big Wall Street players and said, hey, you need to fix this, because if this happens, your business is going to suffer. You're not going to be able to get the market access in China, and it's going to hurt your bottom line big time. So they effectively forced JP Morgan, these big investment banks, to become lobbyists for them because they're going to cut off access. So that's how it works. Whenever you do these entanglements, that is what is going to be expected. And you can certainly see that with Nancy Pelosi, how her attitude changed. Her husband started getting deals in mainland China. Her son went to China looking for deals. She became a lot less aggressive on human rights issues. You see that with Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. We talked about the fact that his family got very lucrative deals in the shipping business in China. They make a ton of money courtesy of the Chinese government. He's far less critical. And what the Chinese are looking for, they're shrewd enough to recognize that you can't expect politicians, when you have this leverage over them, to be robots and say, oh, Mao is great, Xi is great, we love the CCP. That's just not going to fly. They're not going to be sustainable. So what they ask for is what they say, loosely translated to English, is big help with a little bad mouth. In other words, help us on the things that matter to us, which is we want access to your technology, we want access to your capital markets, and we want access to your domestic economy. We want to be able to export as many goods without facing tariffs. Those are the three big things we want. If you give us those three things, the big help, if you want to criticize us for the Uyghurs or for human rights occasionally, it's not really going to bother us. And that's kind of what you get from a lot of these political figures and a lot of these people in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street. They'll occasionally throw a bone and say, yeah, I don't really like what's going on with the Uyghurs. But everything else they say, they praise the Chinese regime. And in fact, with some people in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, I would argue it's not just a leverage situation where they're doing this because they want access to the Chinese market and it's transactional. I do think among some of America's corporate elites and even some political elites, there's an attraction, Brian, to this, what they talk about, the efficiency of China.
Yes.
How things are
talk about this. This is great, because even Justin Trudeau said, he grudgingly admires how quickly they can get things done. This is another thing that you talk about in the book, about the fact that there is a begrudging admiration among our elite, our aristocracy. And let's be honest, they are the aristocracy. They have insane wealth and insane influence. Whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, you can understand how they, first of all, think they're smarter. It's very natural. It's human to think you're smarter than most people. We all have that problem. And then to say, it'd be nice to have China-like power, because I could really, and I'm guilty of this. We all are. The founding fathers knew that this is human nature. But talk about this. There are undercurrents, and maybe not so under, that suggests that a lot of the people in power in this country admire the Chinese top-down control way of doing things.
Yeah, no, they do. I mean, Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, was asked about 8-10 years ago, which political system other than Canada's did he admire the most? Admire the most. Didn't mention the UK, didn't mention the United States. He said China. And he said the reason is in China, you can just get things done with greater efficiency. Well, of course, Brian, all dictatorships have that benefit, right? Yeah. You don't have to worry about independent courts. You don't have to worry about the property rights of people that live. If you want to build a bridge, you just get the hell out of the way. We're building the bridge. This is the kind of efficiency that they admire. You find the same thing in Silicon Valley. Zuckerberg and others will use this phraseology. And it does go, I think, to the root of it, as you pointed out quite accurately. It comes with this kind of hubris and arrogance. Look, the guys in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, obviously very smart. They built these amazing companies. You look at a guy like Zuckerberg, you look at the Google guys, they built these companies really out of nothing. They're fabulously powerful. They're very effective. I understand why they have a lot of pride in their intellect. But the problem is this is how tyrannies develop.
Of course.
Tyrants don't start, Brian, by saying, hey, I want power because I'm going to take your civil rights away and I want to be corrupt and I want to abuse you. No, it's with promises of we're going to get things done. We're going to be efficient. We're going to look out for your interest. And this is the conceit that a lot of them have with regards to China. And I think it's a huge problem. And they're not going to come out and say it as explicitly as Trudeau's going to do, but they're going to use code words. They're going to say efficiency. They're going to say they admire how just quickly things get done in China. And of course they get done because the Chinese Communist Party controls everything. There's no independent judiciary. There's no local government. There's no property rights. There's nothing.
You're talking about checks and balances, and the genius of James Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers in general who drafted this, who solved the political problem, as far as I'm concerned, is that power does not rest in any one particular group's hands. What James Madison was obsessed with was factions. How do we keep a strong faction from gobbling up all the other factions? And I can't believe we don't have a James Madison Day in this country, because we benefit from that every single day. The fact that we have a judiciary, a legislature, the executive, the fourth estate, all these competing interests that are always undermining each other. You have to have that. You have to. Government is not supposed to be efficient. Government is supposed to move very slowly. George Washington made a speech about that when the army was going to march on Washington because they were late with their wages. And, so I think it's such an important point. I think that's why books like this are so important, man, because you've got to expose the flaw in their thinking. We are not a country that should be run by the philosopher kings. If you want that, then, go ahead and read the Republic, but it's ruined that way lies. And so, and you just do a good job of the fact of highlighting the fact, and very scary that there are a lot of people with a lot of power that have this grudging admiration. Just very quick anecdotal story about, I was doing a movie in Beijing, and it was a kid's movie about a talking dog. And I had to run down in the old city of Beijing. It was going to be a 4-day shoot. I was going to have to run down this Chinese guy who was a criminal. And it was a big chase. I'm jumping over water. I'm jumping into it. It was a crazy action thing. And I was going to do all my own stunts, which usually ends up to be a disaster, but leave it to my ego. And so I was going to apprehend this guy, take him to the ground. And I was a cop. When they got that script, when the Chinese government got that script, they said, there is not a shot you are going to have an American national take down a Chinese national in our country. We're not going to shoot that. That's not happening. So we had to rewrite the entire script. So my 2 weeks in Beijing turned out to be about 5 days in Beijing. By the way, thank God. Don't like that city. But it was really interesting, isn't it? It was just unbelievable. I was like, wow. And you talk about LeBron James, or you look at John Cena, who had to apologize for even mentioning Taiwan. If you are in Hollywood and you want your movies to sell, because all that matters is the Chinese market, you better toe the line. So money really does talk.
It does, and it's leverage, and the point is, other countries are not as big as the Chinese market, but I mean, if the European Union got really mad about something, they could exert leverage on Hollywood, but they don't. Because they don't view that's the role of government in civic society, but China doesn't have that view. And this notion of efficiency you were talking about, I think is just so important, because the history of humankind is one in which an elite that seizes power, and that elite can sometimes grow from the common people. You could have a Hitler-like figure who was a pretty common guy who rises to power, but human history is filled with the stories of big leaders who, in the name of efficiency or in the name of the people or any other lofty goal, want to strip you of your rights and take your rights away. And it's very seductive, and you would think that our elites would be smart enough to see it. Maybe they are smart enough to see it.
They'd have to read history, though, Peter. So
right. They'd have to read history. And by the way, they would also have to ignore their own pocketbook. I think it's the combination of the few. It's the naivete and the arrogance they have of themselves and this top-down model, but it's also the amount of money that is at stake. And I don't know how we are going to get our biggest challenge, I think, in shaping a good policy towards China that doesn't lead to war, but also addresses these underlying issues. The biggest challenge is not China. The biggest challenge is our own elites.
Guys, if you like this episode, all you got to do is click this link somewhere over here, and it'll take you over to Mug Club, where you can watch the rest of the episode. You can also watch a bunch of other content, namely Louder with Crowder, Steven Crowder.